Ja, ich wünsche den Anwesenden schon mal einen schönen Abend und sage Hallo. Wir warten allerdings noch ein paar Sekunden, bis sich die Audiosignale verbinden. Das dauert nämlich immer ein bisschen und damit wir alle mitnehmen können, wenn es losgeht, warte ich noch kurz, bis das Audio bei allen funktioniert. So, ich sehe aber, das sieht gut aus, soweit ich sehen kann. Deswegen fangen wir an. Und so, jetzt wünsche ich auch allen, deren Audio jetzt eingesetzt hat, einen wunderschönen Abend und begrüße Sie ganz herzlich zum Transatlantic Tuesday des Carl-Schurz-Hauses. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal aus dem Kulturprogramm des Deutsch-Amerikanischen Instituts und ich begleite Sie heute Abend durch das Gespräch mit Tom Holland über sein Opus Magnum Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind, and there he is waving already. Zu Deutsch ganz druckfrisch erschienen bei Klett-Cotta unter dem Titel Herrschaft, die Entstehung des Westens. Ganz kurz zur Technik, lassen Sie Ihre Mikrofone bitte ausgeschaltet, damit die Audioqualität gewährleistet bleibt. Es gibt am Ende noch die Möglichkeit, wie immer, ein paar Fragen zu stellen. Ja, worum geht es in diesem Buch? Von Babylon bis zu den Beatles, von Moses bis Me Too. Sagenhaft souverän schildert Tom Holland die historischen Kräfte, die die westliche Welt und unsere Wertevorstellungen bis in die Gegenwart prägen. Die Erfindung des Christentums als ein Erdbeben der Geschichte, als echte Revolution. Ein elegant erzähltes Geschichtspanorama, das zeigt, wie wir wurden, wer wir sind. Welches religiöse Erbe, so fragt Tom Holland, schlägt sich in unserer heutigen Gedankenwelt nieder? Mit wirklich gewaltiger Erzählkunst schildert Holland die Geschichte des Westens. Dabei zeigt er, wie genuin christliche Traditionen und Vorstellungen auch in der modernen Gesellschaft und in ihrem scheinbar universellen Wertesystem allgegenwärtig sind, selbst im Säkularismus oder in den Naturwissenschaften, die eigentlich sagen, dass sie gar nicht daran glauben. Holland schlägt einen ganz großen Bogen von den Perserkriegen, von den revolutionären Anfängen des Christentums in der Antike über seine Ausbreitung und Vorherrschaft im europäischen Mittelalter bis zu seiner Verwandlung in der Moderne. Da finden sich ergreifende Szenen in diesem Buch über welthistorische Ereignisse und auch lebendige Porträts über die Protagonisten und die Antagonisten des Christentums, Jesus, Paulus, Abaelard, die heilige Elisabeth, Spinoza, Darwin und Nietzsche. Ganz kurz noch zum Autor, bevor ich dann ins Gespräch komme mit Tom Holland. Tom Holland hat in Cambridge und in Oxford studiert. Er hat sich mit BBC-Sendungen über Herodot, Homer, Thucydides und Virgil einen internationalen Namen gemacht. Er ist mehrfacher Bestseller-Autor, hat viele Preise erhalten und die Bücher, für die er die bekommen hat, sind unter anderem Rubicon über den Fall der Römischen Republik, Persian Fire über die Kriege zwischen Griechen und Persern und Dynasty über Roms erstes imperiales Kaisergeschlecht. Seit 2016 ist Tom Holland Mitglied der Royal Society of Literature und seit 2020 macht er einen fantastischen Podcast zusammen mit dem britischen Historiker Dominic Sandbrook, den ich Ihnen sehr empfehlen möchte. Der Titel ist The Rest is History. And I'm so delighted you're here tonight, Tom. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I wanted to start by delving into my childhood, even though that's a bit pathetic, I guess. But I'm pretty amazed that your childhood is right there in the end of the book. And I had decided on starting with this before I had read the very ending of the book. And so in a way, I think I'm an exhibit for your thesis that Christianity really still touches just about everything about our modern world in the West. I have really vivid memories of my childhood Bible with great illustrations, even though I haven't looked at it for 25 years, if I'm not lying. I went to Jerusalem a few years ago and was like much more touched by like the holy places there, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and so on than I expected, because I'm not Christian, like agnostic on a good day, atheist on a bad day. And still, one can feel in one's stomach how much this still touches our lives in a way. But it's kind of hard to get out of this almost, as you say, universal kind of looking at Christianity. And at the West. So I was wondering if it takes a historian of antiquity to understand and get this kind of bird's eye view on the last few millennia to arrive there.
Well, it's funny that you talk about your childhood, and in a way, the roots of this book are in my childhood too, because people will often, of course, accept that fiction, for instance, novels are often rooted in what the author did in youth or in childhood. But I think often the same is true of non-fiction and the kind of fields of study that people may choose to pursue. And that is certainly true for me, because I grew up, my mother was a Christian. I went to church, I went to Sunday school, I sang in the choir. But the truth was that although I was kind of very interested in the biblical stories, I found myself much more interested in the kind of superpowers of the Near East than I was in the children of Israel. So I was much more interested in the pharaohs and the kings of Babylon and of Assyria than I was in the children, in the Israelites or the people of Judah, who seems much less glamorous to me. And the same with the New Testament. That if you'd given me the choice between Jesus and Pontius Pilate, I was totally on the side of Pontius Pilate, because I found Rome in particular kind of incredibly glamorous. And I was the kind of child who was obsessed by dinosaurs. And in a way, the great empires of antiquity are like dinosaurs. So Rome is kind of like the tyrannosaur of antiquity. It's an apex predator. And I guess on top of that, I found the Greek gods just much more charismatic, interesting, I guess sexy than the Christian god. And it wasn't that I had kind of had a spectacular loss of faith. It wasn't anything like that. It was just like a kind of a dimmer switch gradually going down, and the light of my faith faded, I guess replaced by the kind of the blaze of the Greek gods. And I guess that's why when I came to write history professionally, I wrote about the Roman and the Greek world. In a sense, because I was not doing it in an academic way. I wanted to convey for a general readership something of the excitement and the passion that I felt as an adult, someone who studies these ancient civilizations, but also to connect with a sense of the excitement that I'd felt as a child. But the truth was that writing about the Romans, writing about the Greeks, writing about the Persians, I found myself increasingly questioning the assumption that I'd had through my childhood, through my youth, that I was essentially, that my makeup, my ethics, my morals, my perspectives derived from classical antiquity rather than from Christianity. And increasingly I came to, I guess, a Nietzschean view. I mean, it is the kind of Nietzschean perspective that that in a sense the classical world is kind of terrifyingly alien, terrifyingly distant from us, because Christianity has intervened. And in a sense, Dominion is an attempt, I wrote it as an attempt to explore that supposition, to stress test the idea that actually, in my essence, in my fundamentals, in my convictions, in my beliefs, I'm not a descendant of the classical Greeks. I'm not a descendant of the Romans. I'm a descendant of essentially of Christianity. And I think if that's true of me, then it's true of the society that I've grown up in, and I think of the West more generally. The image that I think I use in the book is that we are goldfish swimming in Christian waters. But actually, when I'd finished the book, a few weeks after I'd finished the book, an even better metaphor struck me when I watched a drama series about Chernobyl, about the explosion in the nuclear reactor there. I don't know if it was shown in Germany, but it was a 3-part series shown here in England. And one of the scenes showed 2 of the main characters standing next to the ruptured power station and you could see the radioactivity leaking because it was ionizing the air. So there was this great blast going up, and you could literally see it. But of course, the impact of the Chernobyl explosion was not just felt where you could see the air ionizing. It was experienced as the cloud of radioactive waste drifted northwards over Kiev, over Eastern Europe, over Scandinavia. And people there couldn't see what they were breathing in, but they were being changed by it. And it's in that sense, I think, that we today, as often we think of ourselves as a post-Christian society, but I think that we continue to breathe in whatever the theological equivalent of radioactivity is. By that, I don't mean that Christianity makes your hair fall out and kills you, just that I think it has transformed the world so profoundly that many of us who live in the world that has been shaped by Christianity don't even recognize it.
Just to add to that, it's just being shown in Germany, actually, because of the anniversary of Chernobyl.
Right.
Yeah, and it's an excellent series. I've watched it last year. It's an interesting metaphor because of what it does to the body, but I'm glad we mentioned it. So what the book shows, and I think that's really powerful, and it also brings me back to childhood, which is in a way a time in one's life where religion has the biggest impact. I think, well, maybe close to death would be another one, but I remembered how much I was like as a mildly religious kid up until I was like 10 or 9 or so, as most kids are, like Northern Protestant. I was kind of haunted by a sense of contingency of Christianity, because I also loved Antiquity and read many books about it, and all the crazy gods, especially the ones who flooded like the later Roman Empire and were in like in a challenge with Christianity in a way. And I mean, in history, there were a few close calls where like another religion could have broken through. Like there's this cult of invincible sun. There's like Mitra with the weird bull rituals. And I mean, there were like Roman emperors who were quite drawn to those. And I've read that there were close calls and we could have become like a Mitra society.
I think that's convinced by that. I don't think so. I mean, I think that clearly I'm saying that Christianity, I think, is radical. I think it's revolutionary. I think it's fundamentally transformative. But that doesn't mean that it just emerges from nowhere. Nothing comes from nothing. Christianity is like a kind of a lake fed by many streams, and those streams are clearly the tradition of Hebrew scripture, the Jewish inheritance. I mean, that's the most obvious. Behind that as well, you have the traditions of Persian dualism, the idea that the Achaemenid Empire in particular initially embodies that you can have a kind of universal order that divides the world into good and evil, into light and darkness, which, you know, for an empire is a brilliant idea, because if you can brand your enemies as being agents of darkness, that provides a, you know, magnificent justification for conquest. So I think that is something that lurks in the background. Then, of course, there's Greek philosophy, but then there is the Roman Empire itself, and the key thing about the Romans is that their city begins of it. You know, it's a city-state. It's rooted, their understanding of the divine, their understanding of what the Roman justification for conquest is rooted in the very, very specific soil of that city-state. But the Romans end up conquering this vast empire, and they claim that it's sine fine, that it is without limits, that in effect, Roman rule is coterminous with the entire span of the world. Now, that's not true, but it establishes an ideology that is very, very important to the way that the Romans justify their rule. And so they have to start constructing a kind of ideological justification for their rule that transcends the merely local conditions of Rome itself. And the first attempt to do that is really the most successful, the fastest growing cult that the world had ever seen. And it emerges in the 1st century AD. And it's not Christianity, it's the cult of Augustus Caesar, who is the son of a god, a prince of peace, who has brought order to the world, who on his death has ascended to sit at the right hand of his divine father, Julius Caesar. So there are all kinds of echoes there that Christianity is playing on. And in a sense, particularly by the 3rd century, when every free male in the Roman Empire is given citizenship, there comes a need to establish a kind of ideological framework that everyone in the empire can sign up to. And in a sense, Caesar worship is inadequate to that. So over the course of the 3rd century and into the 4th, various gods are basically auditioned for the role of kind of divine patron of the entire world. And there's a kind of gathering sense that it has to be a single god, because if you have a single empire, a single emperor, ideally you want a single divine patron who can be truly universal, so that the Roman world can truly feel itself to be universal. And as you say, I mean, Constantine, before he has his vision at the Milvian Bridge, he does indeed. He worships Sol, Invictus, the unconquered sun. He worships Heracles. He worships Apollo. All of these are gods that are kind of given, a chance to prove that they should be the one god of the Roman Empire. But in the end, it's Christ who is given this role. But I think there's very specific reasons why the other gods are inadequate to this role, and why the Christian God proves so successful. And I think it's rooted in the fact that, basically, to speak in purely Darwinian terms, Christianity offers both the rulers and those even at the very bottom of the pile in the Roman Empire an enormous amount, far more than any other god does. And that's basically why Christianity succeeds. It crowds the other rivals, the other gods out. So, which is why I don't think that any other god could have done it. I think that it was always going to be Christ who did it, because he offered his worshippers more than the competition could.
I mean, the meek shall inherit the earth is still like a good slogan for any political campaigner, I guess. It's a good offer, I think. Yeah, I think that's kind of interesting, because it's also in the book. It also says that. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It looked frozen for a second, but that's a relief. It also says in the book that Christianity in the beginning was very much a religion that was imposed from the top to the bottom of the whole empire, and so it's interesting that there's like this dual dynamic almost. Like it's a grassroots movement, and it's at some point the top just decides this is a good thing too.
Well, I mean, it takes time, and of course, Christianity begins with this incredibly shocking notion. I mean, it is unbelievably subversive, and again, the whole book, I mean, it covers such an enormous span that I had to structure it very carefully, and so there's a kind of certain symmetry within the ordering of the book. So the 3rd chapter is very strongly focused on Paul, and it's Paul who, more powerfully than anyone else, focuses on what is scandalous and shocking and subversive about the Christian argument that a slave, a convicted criminal in an obscure corner of the Roman world who has suffered the death of a slave, on this unspeakable form of torture, that in fact he is in some way the one God who has fashioned the entire world. And Paul says, this is a stumbling block to the Jews and to everyone else, i.e., most of the people in the Roman Empire. It's kind of it's lunacy, it's madness, it's absolutely grotesque. And then the 3rd chapter from the end of the book features Nietzsche, who I think in a way is it's a kind of paradox, but far more than most overtly Christian writers, he understands that in a way that Paul had done. He understands the full scale of the blasphemy, of the subversion within this idea that God had been crucified. And I think that the problem for us now is that we've been desensitized to just how shocking, just how scandalous the image of the cross was. And I think that in a sense, although in the 4th century, of course, yes, I mean, Caesar becomes Christian, the Roman Empire becomes Christian. That subversive quality is not, cannot be kind of extracted from Christianity. So in a sense, first the Roman Empire, but then every Christian state, every Christian emperor, every Christian king, every Christian power structure ever since has been like San Francisco built on the San Andreas Fault. You can build wonderful structures, but every so often, there's going to be an earthquake. The tectonic plates are going to grind against each other. Things are going to come tumbling down. And that's why I see the course of Christian history as a constant succession of these convulsions, of these kind of grinding together of the tectonic plates. And I think, that we're living through another one at the moment, really.
Oh, wow. Well, there's something at the end which we should come back to in the end, I think. Actually, that's a good, because you mentioned Paul already, and he was next on my list. I think what makes the book such a good read, even though it's very, very long, is its novelistic quality. I think your prose really leaps from the page. That's really rare in a German work of history, as you probably know. And it really hit me how much you take the reader on the road with figures like Paul. And you can really feel these figures of antiquity, which are kind of foreign to us, and we don't really connect to them in a way to which we probably relate to figures from early modernity or even from the medieval ages, because it feels so distant and so few things are still left. So I was wondering where did you take the sense of security in going on the road with figures like Paul or Origen?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that. And I should say up front, as I told you before we joined, that I'm hugely apologetic that I'm not giving this talk in German. I've never really got beyond the booking a double room with a shower level of German. So I'm hugely apologetic for that. And I entirely appreciate that German is the language of theology and church history. And over the whole course of writing the book, my lack of German massively weighed on me. So I apologize profusely for that. I do think, yes, perhaps there is a different historiographical tradition between English and German traditions. And I guess that because my background is more in popular history than in academic history, I was kind of interested in trying to make Paul seem kind of vivid and shocking, in a way actually that, because I remember when I was a child and sat in church, the various Bible readings, if there was a Bible reading from the Old Testament and it involved, Pharaoh's chariots being drowned or some general having a tent peg hammered through his skull, that was great. And Jesus's parables, they were great as well. But whenever Paul's letters came on, I'd go, oh God, I don't understand a word of this, and I'd kind of switch off. But increasingly, I came to realize that Paul's letters are basically kind of gelignite. I mean, they're the most astonishing letters ever written. They compress, they're kind of like depth charges placed under the Roman world, sending ripples out that continue to kind of reverberate out. So I think they are kind of the most astonishing, the most influential, the most remarkable texts that we have from classical antiquity. So that was the kind of animating idea for me. The sense of what was of what was shocking about them was strongly clarified for me by a film that I made while I was researching Paul. So I went out to northern Iraq in 2016, loaded down with books about Paul, but I was making a film about the ideology of the Islamic State, and in particular why they had targeted the Yazidis, a religious minority in northern Iraq, for basically for genocide. And as part of that, we went to a major Yazidi settlement called Sinjar, which had been occupied by the Islamic State in 2014 when they swept into northern Iraq. And the Islamic State had targeted the Yazidis very, very brutally, even by their own standards. So they had enslaved large numbers of Yazidi women, and indeed girls as young as the age of 8, carried them off into sexual slavery. And they killed lots of the men, and some of the men they crucified. And then when we went to Sinjar, the Kurds had just recaptured it. And so the Islamic State were about a mile or so across open land. So within mortar range, if we went out into the open area where there were various mass graves to look at them, within sniper range. So it felt very close and very real. And I realized, standing in the rubble of this town where people had been enslaved and crucified, that I was as close to the experience of a city stormed by the Romans as I was hopefully ever going to get to in my life. I was within striking distance of people for whom the cross represented what it had represented for the Romans, an instrument of torture designed to intimidate and terrify conquered people. And I came back, I rewrote the opening of the book to focus on the strangeness and the horror and the power of crucifixion as an idea. But it incredibly sharpened for me the strangeness of what Paul was preaching, and the sense that Paul, in his letters, I think you have the constant sense that he himself is constantly wrestling with the weirdness of it all, which I don't think you, as a child, I ever got, because it's being read in a church. It's kind of like, you're reading out, I don't know, the Constitution of the United States or something. It's something that sounds solid and frozen and definite. But that's not what Paul is basically saying. Okay, so this is what I think. This is my understanding of what's happened. I've had this vision of the risen Christ. I've tried to place it in the context of Hebrew scriptures, which I, as a Pharisee, am very familiar with. And basically, this is the conclusion that I've come to. And I know that it's unbelievably weird, but guys, this is what follows. And he's so convinced of this, of course, that he basically chucks in, this brilliant career he's had, and he becomes a kind of wandering bum, a wandering tramp. And, rather like ISIS used the internet, which was set up by the American empire to perpetuate its power. So Paul uses the infrastructure that the Romans have set up. He uses the ships, that get him across the Mediterranean without being attacked by pirates. And of course, he uses the roads that the legions have built. And this is what enables him to go to all these various places, spreading his weird message. And he ends up in Rome. And I think that's what I hadn't got, was the sense of the strangeness of it. So that's what I very much wanted to try and convey, was a sense of just how strange it was.
Yeah, I think,
and just how disorienting and bizarre, even to Paul, and even to Christians in the decades and the centuries that follow him. So I think it's really striking that the visual images of the crucifixion are so late. I think not until the beginning of the 5th century you get pictures of Christ on the cross, and even then he's kind of like a Greek athlete. He's kind of toned and buff, like someone who's just won a race in the Olympic Games or something. It's not until the year 1000 that we start to get images of Christ actually dead on the cross, and it's just too shocking. And as I say, we've become desensitized to that, I think.
I think it's actually, that's exactly what the book does so well. And it's like, when you read the chapters, especially on the aftermath of the crucifixion, it's so disconcerting and so stunning that these events really took place, and it really happened, and stuff happened from there, and these absolute underdogs became the people who created the from 2,000 years.
And I mentioned the cult of Augustus and Galatia. Paul writes one of his letters to the Galatians, but Galatia was clearly a major cult center for Augustus. A lot of the material and the evidence that we have for the Augustan cult comes from Galatia. So I think that the role that this gospel, this good news, this euangelion that Paul is preaching as a parody of the cult of Caesar, it seems to me very, very evident. And obviously what's shocking about it for people in the Roman world isn't the idea that a mortal has become a god, because Augustus has become a god. It's the idea, Augustus and Julius Caesar and other emperors and other kings become gods because they're great men, they're great warriors, they're great conquerors, they're great rulers. But the idea that someone who's suffered the death of a slave, that's the strangeness. And it's, why is crucifixion the fate, the punishment inflicted on a slave? Not just because it's agonizingly painful, not just because it's protracted, but because it's your death and your agony is public, and therefore you're shamed by it. And people will gather and watch you, and there's nothing you can do to beat off the birds as they cluster around and maybe peck out your eyes, peck at your genitals. People will stand and laugh at you as that happens. And that's the humiliation and the shame of it. And that's why it's fitting for a slave to die that way. And Paul is saying, yeah, the one God who made the world suffered that fate.
Yeah,
actually, it's transcendently odd.
Actually, like a good companion read maybe to your book is this very small book by Colm Tóibín, by the Irish author, The Testament of Mary, who tells the story of the crucifixion in a way that really impressed me so much, and it's so vivid and so way beyond any convention from a dusty church. It's really amazing, and I think that feeling and that sense readers can find in your book as well, and it's really very interesting. I wanted to maybe this is a bit controversial, but I kept thinking about the Council of Nicaea as like this first point in Christian history, maybe where you can see this kind of complex forming between Roman bureaucracy, basically like the state, and the full might of this very brutal empire, which is not the last the world will see, and Christian theology. And I think in the early chapters, you cannot help but root for Christians in a way, because they're the underdogs. The ideas the religion transports and gives to people are just very charming still, I think. And from there on, it gets a little bit more complicated, I think. Like once Christianity emerges, not as the underdog, but as the top dog, everything else just gets more complicated, I think. And I think you can feel it in the book too. Was that like a challenge to go from there, from this like adrenaline rush of early Christianity to everything that comes afterwards, which is much more complicated and muddled?
Well, what I felt throughout the book was that Christianity is an immense snarl, immense matrix, an immense knot of paradoxes. And of course, the foundational paradox is Jesus is both man and God. He suffers the death of a slave. He rises to become the king of the universe. The paradox is absolutely inherent there. The core paradox, really, and it's one that runs right from the beginning, and it's the great shadow that hangs over the Christian story, is that Christianity is simultaneously a faith that valorizes the poor, the underdog. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. And the most, and it's there in the Old Testament, it's there in the Exodus story. God is on the side of the slaves, he's not on the side of Pharaoh. It's there in the narrative of the passion. God is on the side of the guy who gets crucified rather than the guy who's doing the crucifying. That is the kind of the great animating idea. And it's this that leads Paul to say that, this Christ has died for everyone, for the weak as well as for the strong, for the poor as well as for the rich. And so all differences ultimately are dissolved. And so writing to the Galatians, he says that there is no Greek or Jew. There is no man or woman. There is no slave or free. The traditional hierarchies, the traditional divisions are erased. And this is an incredibly inspiring message. And it's this message that basically, I think, inchoately Constantine recognizes as the way of basic, this is the power of Christianity, is that the traditional divisions are dissolved. But this universalist ambition of Christianity, which I think modern Western multicultural societies are absolutely committed to. I mean, I think that, there is no Greek or Jew, there's no man or woman, there's no slave or free. These are the kind of ideals that underpin modern Western multiculturalism. It underpins the idea that racism is bad, that sexism is bad, that slavery is bad, that all these things are shocking when seen in the first century. In the 21st century, we take them completely for granted. But there is a problem, because the very universalism of this claim can potentially become oppressive. And again, if we look at Paul, it's there implicitly in the beginning. So there is no Greek or Jew. Brilliant. Everybody, we're all the one. We're all kind of children of God. It's Bennett and Ad. We're all, different people from different countries, different skin colors. We're all the same. But what if you're a Jew who doesn't want to have his or her difference dissolved into a kind of universalist mush? Most Jews do not accept what Paul is saying. And so right from the beginning, there's a tension between the universalism of this message and the potential for oppression of people who do not want to be a part of it. So the relationship of Christianity to the Jews is obviously the great blot right from the beginning. I mean, it's a kind of darkness that runs throughout the entire story. But it's there as well in, what do Christians do with Christians maybe who believe, the wrong thing? So that's what the Council of Nicaea sets up by establishing a creed. I believe, a credo, I believe. What about Christians who don't believe that? What about heretics? What about people who want to carry on worshipping the traditional gods? People who come to be called pagans? In the long run, what about Muslims? What about the people who, Christians, when they start to sail across the world in the 16th century, what about them? And I think that the measure of how deeply Christian the liberal West is that we still face that question. What do we do with people who don't want to, for instance, how do you tolerate the intolerant, that kind of thing? These are questions that are kind of bred of the marrow of this foundational Christian paradox, that the powerless become powerful, and that but a universal message ends up persecuting those who do not want to be a part of that universality.
Actually, that connects me to what I wanted to go next, and that's the book is sorted in 3 big chapters. The first is on Antiquity. The third one is modernity, basically. And the one in the middle is not called medieval times, Middle Ages or anything like that, but Christendom. It's like a synonym for the historical period. I found that a very inspired choice. And I think that the story from late antiquity and this slow march to the top into the Middle Ages, where Christendom will become like dominant in Europe, all powerful, in the story of the 11th century and Gregory VII, as you tell it in the book, but also in this process. And there we have this idea of universalism, and what if people don't want to buy what I'm selling, is of course conversion. And there are many conversion stories in your book which read like adventure stories, and people go to the British Isles, which are like basically North Pole country in those times, everything beyond.
Well, except that Britain had been part of the Roman world, so
yeah.
that's why Gregory the Great sends a mission to Britain. So it's not, but where's really beyond the pole is Germany. Because the Germans kind of were never defeated Augustus's legions, and so lurking in the murk of the Saxon forests, that really is the back of beyond. And actually, you see again what's so that I think that the strangeness of the idea that everything should be universal, that Paul understands this, but I think when the Roman world becomes Christian, it doesn't. Augustin understands it too. Augustin properly understands that the Christian message is for everyone, that Rome is just a kind of detail. It's a kind of, a bubble on the great stream of time that will kind of wink and bead and then vanish. But most Roman Christians are so chauvinist that they assume that Christianity is just for Romans. Mm-hmm. Which is why Gregory, who's a Roman aristocrat, he will send missionaries to Britain because Britain had been part of the Roman world. He doesn't think to send them to the Germans. But the Anglo-Saxons, when they become Christian, because they're not Roman, they read through the Gospels and they see it through basically, as we would. They see this message is for everyone, and so that's why they, Boniface and so on goes to Germany and to Frisia and to Saxony and so on, and preaches the gospel there, and then in due course to the Scandinavian world as well, and and then ultimately, of course, missionaries spread out across the entire world. But it's the process by which Christianity evolves. It's constantly kind of adapting, mutating, transforming existing assumptions that the Romans take for granted, and over the course of the centuries, just radically reconfiguring them, which is why I think Christianity constitutes such a radical break, and why it's so difficult for us to kind of look to the pre-Christian world and see it except through Christian eyes. It's almost impossible. Almost everything we do is, you don't have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended into heaven to see the world through Christian eyes. It's at the most basic level of language. So, and I felt this very strongly writing about Greece and Rome. In English, a language so saturated by Christian assumptions, just the same in German, that words that in English like secular, like religion, we've been using religion quite freely today, but actually religion carries this massive Christian freight. If you start using the word religion to describe Mithraism or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism, you're kind of implicitly Christianizing it. And it's on that kind of level that I think it's such an effort to realize just how Christian we are.
Yeah. Another big word in the book which pops up again and again, and I think it really starts to get prominent in the middle chapter on the Middle Ages, is reformatio, which is like a word we also still use all the time in politics, for example. It's always like there always needs to be reforms. Everything needs to be reformed constantly. And I think this kind of emotional cycle of things constantly having to be purified in a way, and always cycles of renewal, and things get stale again, and then we go back there. That starts so much earlier than the actual Reformation, which is of course something that's so prominent in Germany. And that really struck me with the book, that it's centuries before Luther ever took breath, that people felt this constant need of, oh, the church has gotten stale, we need reformatio. And I think it's so interesting that in the beginning, this almost seems to help like the institutional church. It strengthens the popes, for example, this kind of dynamic, and then in the end it breaks them. Do you think that was always going to happen?
Well, I mean, it's there right from the beginning, but it's there on the level of the individual. So the individual has to be born again, has to be washed clean. The ritual of baptism is a washing away of sin, a coming into a new order of being. What happens in the 11th century in the western half of the empire, and the book, I don't write about the eastern half because I'm focused on what's been globally seismic, and I think it's the Latin half of Christendom that really kind of blasts off and creates the modern world. And it does that because the idea that you can basically apply the model of baptism, of kind of purifying yourself, of reforming yourself, of cleansing yourself, ends up being applied to the fabric of the whole of society. And you're right that it's the people who push this through are kind of radicals who seize control of the bishopric of Rome and transform it into an agency of revolution. And I think the word Middle Ages, medieval, it conjures up kind of ideas of hidebound superstition and kind of being sunk in the mire of the opposite of Enlightenment. But the medieval world is Europe's first revolutionary society, and the papacy is Europe's first revolutionary institution. And this ambition to cleanse and purify the world leads to, famously, as Bismarck complained, the humbling of a German emperor in snow at Canossa. It sees armed warriors going to the ends of the world, not just to Jerusalem, but against the Muslims in Spain, against the pagans in the Baltic. It leads to the foundation of radical new institutions that are trying to fathom a progressive way of structuring law, which come to be called universities, and the idea that law should be progressive, that you can progressively come to understand God's purpose, in turn leads to the idea that, if the rich have duties to the poor, then the poor have rights. And so this radical idea that human beings have rights is a product of this kind of revolutionary society. And it establishes a template for the idea that society should be reformed, that old things should be brought down, which is incredibly weird by the lights of of the kind of the classical world. And the problem, of course, is that the radicals who in the 11th century have seized control of the papacy, by the 15th century have become the status quo. They've become the establishment, and they are either persecuting those who haven't come far enough, who are resentful of this new order, or they're having to persecute people who feel that the revolution hasn't gone far enough. And in the 16th century, you get another great spasm of reformatio with Luther and Calvin and what we call the Reformation. And the reformers in the 16th century are using exactly the same language that the reformers in the 11th century had. They're saying, we need to wipe the world clean of superstition. We need to topple the false idols that we've raised. We need to bring people who are in darkness into light. And this language is incredibly powerful. By the 18th century, we get another iteration of it with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, again, is saying, well, we've had, just as the reformers in the 16th century look back at the age of the medieval world, and they conjure up the idea of there being a medieval period, a middle age, between the purity of the early church and the Reformation. So the Enlightenment pulls the same trick, except increasingly Enlightenment thinkers say, well, actually, we've switched on the light, and the whole Christian period is a period of darkness. So we're going to start locating light in the pre-Christian world. We're going to start sort of enshrining Greek philosophers and so on as the model to follow. And that basically is this Enlightenment world, which is spiced up by the French Revolution, by the Russian Revolution, I think by the 60s and the aftermath of that, that model of history that's also an incredibly powerful myth, which you will get with agnostics and with atheists saying, the whole of Christianity is superstition and nonsense, and we've got to get rid of it. Most famously exemplified by the preamble to the abortive European Constitution, where the European Constitution said, we stand in debt to Greece and Rome and to the Enlightenment, and everything in between was just ignored. But I don't think there is a Middle Age. I just think there's one great fracture point, which is the one that Bede identifies, which is BC and AD. It's the incarnation that is the great dividing line. And so our date kind of perpetuates that. I don't believe in that there was a Middle Age. I think that the 11th century, the 16th century, the 18th century, the revolutions we've had since the French Revolution, all of these are simply, I talked about this kind of depth charge that early Christianity represents, sending out these ripples, these explosions, these shocks. These reformationes, these which we get with the Papal Revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, into the present day. These are the ripple effects. They're still going out. We can't escape them.
Wow. I can hear the sound of the Freiburg tourist industry like cracking up at you, like erasing the Middle Ages, and I think that's terrible for them.
No, but the Middle Ages as Europe's first revolutionary society, I think Freiburgers would love that, because it would say, we have the beautiful buildings, but they're not just kind of beautiful and boring and dull and tweedy and old. These are, you are in a town that was a crucible of everything that's made you. That makes it much more exciting, I think.
Well, you should consider like a second career in tourism marketing or something if the books don't flow anymore, which I hope they always will. I want people to encourage to use the chat function for the last portion of the evening. If you have a question that I haven't asked or that's not been answered, you can type it into the chat. I will select one or two at the very end. As we are sprinting through 2,000 years of Christian history, you can tell it's a lots of history. It's so hard to pick what to talk about. I can speak for myself there. But something that really piqued people, I think, about the ideas in your book, which also makes people maybe doubt some theories in it, is how wily you are in reframing every historical event, basically everything that's important, as something that's sprung from Christianity. And you do it very successfully, but I always wonder, like you've mentioned the French Revolution, it's the American Revolution, it's communism. And it's so convincing in the book that at the end, you almost want to like pause for a moment and think, did he trick me? Is this true? Can it all be one fits all, one idea that's getting repeated and just different costume?
Well, yes, I think it can. I think it can. I think that's exactly what it is. But not everything is Christian. And so, for instance, I think the first great intellectual movement that is not Christian and is radically anti-Christian is Darwinism. Oh. So I think Darwin, I think Galileo, I think Voltaire, I think Robespierre, they're all, seems to me, clearly operating within Christian paradigms and assumptions. Darwin is not. Because essentially what Darwin is doing is, in the context of the Victorian society that he's living in, is re-enshrining that Roman primacy of the strong over the weak, the survival of the fittest. And although Darwin himself does not coin that phrase, his cousin does, and it gets used very, very quickly as essentially an explanation of what Darwin is arguing. And Darwinism emerges at a time where people in Christian countries are really keen to have this message. So they are, Europeans and Americans are swallowing up the lands of other people. They are often, kind of near genocidal approaches to the people whose lands they're stealing. And as Marx recognizes, this is a period of tearaway capitalism, where again the rich want to be told that they deserve their wealth and their power and their prosperity, and they don't want this kind of nagging sense that Christianity tells them that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. And that's why Darwinism kind of is very welcome to people. And it kind of it restores intellectual credibility to the classical idea that beauty and strength are synonymous. And Nietzsche then picks that up. And Nietzsche recognizes far more profoundly than his predecessors just how Christian French revolutionaries, Kant, that insidious Christian he calls him, socialists, communists, liberals, he sees their fundamental assumptions are all rooted in Christianity, and that essentially if you want to, if God is dead, then in the long term that means that the values that God had taught are dead as well, and that therefore a great age of upheaval will come. And of course Nietzsche is right, a great age of upheaval does come, and it comes in the form of fascism, because fascism again is a properly anti-Christian movement. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution had targeted institutional Christianity. Had closed down the monasteries, had smashed up the churches, had in the case of the Russian revolutionaries, had very savagely targeted Christian belief. But the Russian Revolution was committed to the two fundamental Christian ideas. Firstly, that there's a fundamental universal quality to humanity. Basically, in Christian terms, in Jewish terms, that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. That there is no Greek or Jew, there is no slave or free. All are fundamentally equal. That is when the new Jerusalem will be built on earth. That is when class will wither away. That is the classless paradise that Marx promises. And likewise, that idea, woe unto the rich, Christ says. He doesn't say woe unto the rich who don't give to charity. He says woe unto the rich. And again, that is the kind of foundational idea becomes the foundational idea of the Russian Revolution. So the idea that all human beings are fundamentally equal, and the idea that there is a kind of the weak have a kind of quality of virtue by virtue of being weak, which Nietzsche hated. But these are ideas that are very, very powerfully fundamental to the practice of the Russian Revolution. But it's everything that the fascists reject. And Mussolini is obsessed both by antiquity, so fascism, the fasces, the bodyguards of Roman magistrates carry on their shoulders. Mussolini casts himself as the new Augustus, but they're also obsessed with a post-Christian future, airplanes and speed and all that kind of thing. And of course, it gets even more kind of post-Christian under the Nazis, because the idea that there is no Jew or Greek, that's absolutely abhorrent to Hitler. The idea that Greeks and Jews are very different is absolutely fundamental. And the idea that there is any strength or dignity or virtue in weakness, again, is completely abhorrent to the Nazis. And the Nazis do what they do, not because they think that they're being evil, but because they think what they're doing is right, is the right thing to do. It gets defeated, but the shock of what Europe has been through with fascism and specifically with the Nazis is so overwhelming, because we see them as the quintessence of evil, because they have offended against the core doctrines of what have been the core doctrines of European civilization for 1,000 years and more. And these are Christian doctrines. And in the wake of the Second World War, one of the reasons I think why Christian belief, doctrinal Christianity, fades, why people stop going to church, is basically because the Nazis provide us with a more vivid myth than Christianity had done. So before the Nazis, people will say, what should I do? Right? What would Jesus do? That's what I'll do. After the Nazi period, people say, what would Hitler do? And do the opposite.
Mm.
It's still a form of Christianity, but it's just we don't need the devil anymore because we've got Hitler, and we don't need hell anymore because we've got Auschwitz. And these become the great myths of post-war Western liberalism. And up to this day, you just have to go on Twitter and get in an argument, and you can guarantee that within 5 minutes someone will accuse you of being Hitler or a Nazi. But I think the reason for that is fundamentally Christian again. And the reason that the Nazis are we hold them to be the embodiment of evil is because they, unlike the communists, trampled on the fundamentals of Christian belief, which is why it's shocking to see a swastika in public, but you will often see the hammer and sickle, even though Stalin and Mao killed just as many people, if not more, than Hitler did.
Mm. Wow, that's a lot to swallow. Before I want to read you one or two questions from the chat, I wanted to mention, because I cannot not mention it as a German and for a German audience, that right at the end of the book, there's also a little bit about Germany again, about our now fading chancellor, Angela Merkel, often called the pastor's, the preacher's daughter, because she is one. That's one of her most quoted. She's a physician and she's a preacher's daughter, basically. That's always the twofold description. And the situation in 2015, which brought shadows and ghosts from the future back to this country and to other countries in the world. And I was wondering, I think that's a very thoughtful and ambivalent part in the book. Right at the end, you can feel the author thinking, I think, and not being decided on everything, and not on the future of humankind in the West, I think. But I was wondering how this debate about Christian values, universal values maybe, and this uneasy tension between them will play in the politics we have since 2015 and 2016, and which will continue.
Well, it did seem to me that debate, that great drama of that summer, was a very Christian drama. Merkel, her father wasn't just a pastor, was he? He looked specifically after people who were, particularly suffering, and essentially, I think that what lurked behind that whole episode was the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's the power. The whole point of the Good Samaritan is that you should care for people who are not like you, who don't have your beliefs. It's the Samaritan who looks after the Jew, not the other Jews. And therefore, if people are coming who are not of Christian background, who are Muslim, then based on that parable, you have a responsibility to care for them and to look after them and to help them. And that's a kind of fundamental core Christian conviction. Against that, there are the evidence of at least 1,000 years of history, more 1,400 years of history, where Christians have had to fight for their survival. Members of Christian states, members of Christian kingdoms have had to fight for their survival to prevent themselves from being conquered and annexed. And obviously, throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern period, the most dangerous enemies that Christian states in Europe faced were Muslim ones. And so the memories of Christians fighting for their faith against Muslims is also a fundamental part of Christian history. And that's what Viktor Orban, who I believe, I mean, I don't know the extent to which he is a practicing Christian now. I mean, originally he was an atheist, but maybe he's just a cultural Christian. But in raising that banner, he too was being Christian. So that Orban's response and Merkel's response are both, they're both an expression of the kind of Christian historical inheritance. And I think that for a long time, at least for a couple of centuries, in fact, actually, since I think basically since the Congress of Vienna, when the Protestant British Foreign Secretary, who was being pushed by public opinion back in Britain to abolish slavery for very Protestant reasons, to do with the idea that the spirit had manifested itself through evangelicals, through Quakers, and revealed to evangelicals that slavery was wrong. Even though it didn't say that in the Bible, the Spirit had animated them and enabled them to understand the text of Scripture and reveal to them that slavery was wrong. And therefore, Castlereagh had to go to Vienna and say, guys, we've got to get rid of slavery. But the people he had to persuade there, the foreign ministers of Spain, Portugal, in due course of France, were Catholic. So they had to construct a framework of law that would patrol the slave trade that both Catholics and Protestants could accept. And so this kind of lays the framework for the model of international law that Europeans and then Americans would spread around the world. But it's a deeply Christian model, but it disguises the fact that it's Christian. And, again, kind of the origin of human rights, the idea of human rights in 12th century Catholic universities gets occluded, because if Europeans and Americans are going around the world saying you've got to do this because it's what it's what Christianity demands, people are not going to do it. But if you go around and say, well, these are universal human rights, these are part of our universal patrimony, then people are likely to accept it. And the economic, the military, the financial power of the West for 2 centuries has basically enabled Western people to pass off their values as being universal without having to kind of draw on Christian theology or Christian scripture to justify it. I think that that's now changing, because as Western power retreats, so its assumptions come to seem ever more culturally contingent. And so we saw that last summer with Erdogan converting the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia back into a mosque, and Narendra Modi in India planting a massive great temple to Rama on what had been the ruins of a mosque, and trampling on the kind of legacy of secular India, which in turn was an inheritance from the Christian British. I think that the conceit that we in the West have, that something called the secular is a neutral notion rather than being bred of very Christian circumstances and assumptions, that's no longer sustainable. In an age where China is the most powerful nation on the world, the assumption that human rights have an objective existence, again, is impossible. Human rights don't exist any more than angels do.
Wow.
These are kind of theological concepts that depend on a leap of faith. So, if you're going to believe in human rights, it requires just as much a leap of faith as believing that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah, well.
And living in a multipolar world, a world in which people in the West cannot assume that everyone shares their assumptions, we're going to have to start justifying our faith positions in ways that our ancestors used to do in a more overtly Christian age. Yeah. It seems to me.
I've picked 2 questions for the very end. The first is by Felicitas, who wants to ask you that you mentioned in your book that secularity and therefore the separation of church and state is an inherently Christian concept. Yet we are of the opinion that especially politics should be secular, or even that politics are indeed secular? What can we learn from the interplay of Christianity and politics, even though it is hidden from view? Is anything neutral in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the secular is completely Christian, and it's you know, the germ is there. It's, I mean, you know, it's there in the famous story of Jesus being shown, you know, being asked, should we pay taxes to Rome, and asking for a coin and showing Caesar's head and asking whose head it is and being told it's Caesar's and saying, well, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. It's there in the image that I talked of right at the beginning of Jesus in front of Pontius Pilate. You know, my kingdom is not of this world. But it becomes enshrined for Latin Christendom by Augustan. And Augustine is wrestling with the sack of Rome, and people who are not Christian saying this is what comes of abandoning the traditional gods, the traditional rites, what Romans call religiones, the bonds that join us to the gods. We've chucked them in, and this is why Rome has fallen. And Augustine says no, because there is only one religio that binds us, you know, and that's through the church, and everything else belongs to the dimension of what he calls the saeculum, which is essentially the limit of human existence. And so the saeculum comes to mean the churn of time, and human lives are born upon this churn of time. So is Rome. You know, Rome is as much a part of the saeculum as individual human beings. And so that enshrines for Latin speakers this idea of a polarity between the saeculum and that of the church, which provides the religio, which joins humans to the eternity of heaven. And over the course of the medieval period into the early modern period, this evolves to become what in English we call the secular and religion. And these are ideas that, you know, the British and the Americans then export around the world. And the fact that English is now the global language means that people who learn English in Africa or India, or, you know, or even in China, in a way are kind of internalizing these very Christian categories and concepts. But you can see, you know, that's what's so interesting about Modi, is that, you know, India is officially a secular republic. The idea of the secular is, you know, along with cricket and the English language, one of the three great legacies that the British left. But I think secular, the idea of the secular will go before cricket does.
Wow. We shall see. And the last question is a whopper, but I am gonna pose it to you still. It's by Samuel, who wants to know, Christian thought is no doubt an underpinning of Western civilization, but the Christian church has for much of its existence been a really bankrupt institution, not practicing what it preached. How do you explain the prevalence of Christianity despite its practice being so wildly deviant? Deviant, is that a word?
Yeah.
From its principles. Well, you learn something new every day.
Because, as Augustine would say, we live in a fallen world. So even the church, therefore, is bred of fallen humanity. You know, there is this great theological argument that Augustine has with actually the very first British intellectual, Pelagius. And Pelagius argues that it is possible for human beings to perfect themselves, that it is possible to establish heaven on earth. And Augustine says, no, we can't, because we are inherently fallen. And so it's that essentially obliges Christians always to kind of look into their heart and to question them, both themselves and indeed the church. And it's that in turn that inspires these endless bouts of reformatio. And just as the reformatio of the 11th century essentially comes to cast the Christendom of the early medieval period as corrupt and evil and in need of cleansing. So the 16th century Reformation casts the medieval church in the same light, and then the Enlightenment philosophes come to cast the whole of Christianity in that light. But I think that when we say that Christianity is evil, or the church is evil, has done terrible things, and people will talk about the Spanish Inquisition or the Crusades or whatever. The salient fact is that we are judging the church by Christian standards. So when we condemn crusaders, we're condemning them for not putting up the sword. We're condemning them in terms that derive from the Gospels. And likewise, when we condemn innocent people being condemned to death by the apparatus of state power in, say, 16th century Spain by the Inquisition, what is it? Why are we so culturally predisposed to be appalled by the idea of an innocent person being sentenced to a horrible death by the apparatus of a great power? And the answer is there in every church, in the form of Christ on the cross. So I think that, and I think that is true of most agnostics and atheists as well. That very few atheists are willing to go the full Nietzsche, if I put it like that. So most atheists are kind of impeccably liberal, but that liberalism is Christian, and their hostility to God is couched in ways that derive from Christianity. So that is one further final clinching Christian paradox, is that in a sense, atheism is a logical endpoint of a certain tradition within Christianity. Wow. That Christianity is all about the desacralization of the world, going all the way back to the Hebrew prophets, who are telling the Babylonians and the Egyptians that their gods are just stone and wood. They're not real. And then when Boniface is going into Saxony and chopping down the tree that is sacred to the gods there and turning it into a church, he's saying, this has no sacral power. The springs, the trees, the groves, these are not, there is no divinity immanent within them. There is only the one God. And gradually, over the course of the centuries, we have kind of arrived at the logical endpoint, which is to say, actually, there's no God at all. but atheists. So Richard Dawkins, who's the most famous atheist here, I don't know if he has a reputation in Germany as well, but I mean, he certainly in the English-speaking world, he's probably the most famous atheist. His argument is that that superstition has to be got rid of, that idols have to be toppled, and that if people do that, then the light of truth will enter their hearts and minds, and they will attain true fulfillment. That's a Christian message.
Okay, I see and I acknowledge we cannot escape. Message is loud and clear. It might be a golden cage, but it is a cage nonetheless. I want to thank you so much for doing this. I want to hold the book into the camera one more time, the English one. It is called Dominion, The Making of the Western Mind. It is out in German as well as Herrschaft, die Entstehung des Westens. It's also, it's entered the Sachbuch Bestenliste, like the non-fiction best list in Germany on the 4th place already. I've just seen this week, so it's getting great reviews in Germany as well. You should get it and pick it up at your local bookstore. You should also subscribe to The Rest is History, the great podcast coming out twice every week now, a joy of my daily life. And you should also, if you have an account as well, follow Tom on Twitter. And before we end, and I'm going to hand the last word to Tom then, in German, I'm just going to say what's on the menu next week. Nächste Woche im Transatlantic Tuesday Programm an dieser Stelle zur selben Zeit haben wir einen ganz besonderen Leckerbissen für Sie, und zwar die großartige Friedenspreisträgerin und deutsche Starintellektuelle Caroline Ehmke ist zu Gast. Und sie spricht mit Daniel Mendelssohn, dem großen amerikanischen Altphilologen und Intellektuellen, über ein Jahr Corona, transatlantische Tagebücher in Zeiten der Pandemie. And with that, thank you so much, Tom. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.